Hello everyone and welcome back to our three-part class on motion pictures, history, and business and art in our mass media, electronic media class. This is motion pictures part 2. It's a big topic, so we're going to spend 3 classes on motion pictures. All right, let's get started. As we get into the late 1940s, on the business side of things, this is a big part of all business, or of all media, is the business side, and we have the fall of the studio system. So we spent some time talking about the studio system, mass production of this product, and vertical integration. And now we have the fall of the studio system. There are 4 big reasons why it fell. The first one is the Paramount decision. Supreme Court ruled that studios could not be vertically integrated, and they had to sell off their theater chains. And this was very upsetting, that they were really how they made the money, basically renting seats in these beautiful theaters. Now, the theaters were not all quite as nice as the Chinese theater, but they were in the downtown areas, big, beautiful buildings and things. So, you know, that was worth a lot of money, right? They were prime real estate right in the middle of many cities. So they had to sell those off. They made money by selling them off. They would have preferred not to have sold them off, but they weren't taken from them or anything like that, but they had to sell them off or divest themselves of these wonderful theater chains. A lot of the theaters still have the name of the original studio. So there is a Fox Theater in Fullerton, and there are Warner Theaters around, and so on. But that's the first nail in the coffin. Second part is that the studio lots that they had, these big back lots, as they called them, were not being used so much. There was more filming on locations. Cameras had gotten smaller over the succeeding years, and all of this land, I think this is Universal here, which is still around, but a lot of the studios had to sell off a lot of that land. They weren't using it, and it was taxed pretty highly. These studios were formed in the 1920s out in the country among the orange groves, and now the city of Los Angeles had filled in all around them, and there are housing developments and all of that, and they're no longer out in the country, and the taxes were quite high for all this land. So a lot of the studios had to sell off hundreds of acres of their back lots, and some of them became cities. MGM sold off quite a bit, and that became Culver City, and 20th Century Fox sold off a lot of their land, and that became Century City. So there was quite a bit of land, and they had to sell it off because it was so expensive. Third part is the actors, and here we see a very famous actor. This is Clark Gable, one of the most famous actors ever in motion picture history, and the biggest star in the 1930s, and chances are you don't know who he is. And again, it's not on you, it's just how fame is rather fleeting. And the big stars of today, the Matts and the Leos and all the 4 Chris's, will probably be lost to history in 30 or 40 years. So anyway, time passes, history moves on, and when you're an old-timer like me and somebody asks you who that guy was, and you're going to laugh and think to yourself, he or she was such a big star back when I was 19 or 20, and now the kids today don't even know who Chris or Matt or Leo was. So anyway, that's just what happens when you get old. But the actors, they start getting out of their contracts. They start getting what is called a back-end deal. Their agents are getting them a percentage of the gross. So instead of just a salary, they are getting a part of the gross. Now, if the movie doesn't gross very much, then they don't make quite as much. But if the movie is a big hit, then they make lots and lots of money. And this started happening in the 1950s for sure, and it is really part of the industry today. And actors were signed to studios, exclusive contracts to studios. Clark Gable was signed to MGM, and they could loan him out to other studios or keep him in. It was a very paternalistic system, and the agents start getting them non-exclusive contracts so that somebody, a big star like Clark Gable, can make 1 or 2 movies at one studio and then move on, and he's not under the same contract for 7 years. The fourth part, probably the big one, is the rise of television. And the studios really ignored it at first. They sort of dealt with radio fine. They sort of engulfed radio. A lot of radio stars became movie stars. But the studios, they ignored it and they fought it. And then finally, 10 or 15 years in, they finally embraced television. But that was a very important 10, 12 years. They really didn't start embracing television to the late 50s. And by then, it was kind of late. They probably should have gotten in on the ground floor and maybe even owned some of the television networks, like NBC or CBS or ABC. But they fought it, and it took them a while, right? Those are very important years. And I have linked to a wonderful video on letterboxing, because that is the studio response. They started making widescreen movies. And if you went to a movie theater, or if you go to a movie theater today, the screen changes size. Okay, our television screens, our computer screens, they are fixed. They don't change size. But these big, giant, wide screens started being installed in movie theaters, and curtains could open up to reveal a square-ish screen, like the old days, 4:3 aspect ratio, or they could open, and the screen would be this big, huge, giant screen behind the curtain. So the screen actually changed size starting in the early 1950s. And we start getting these big, wide screens. Now, this is all going to be a problem when movies start showing up on television. So the documentary that I have linked to you is from a cable channel called Turner Classic Movies, TCM, and they are going to be talking about letterbox and how television dealt with this very wide screen with its very square aspect ratio. And this slide right here kind of shows what's going on. This slide is fairly square. And we have this very wide picture. So how are we going to show this very wide picture? If we want to fill the screen, right, fill the screen with picture, then we're only going to be showing the middle part of the movie, right? And basically we'd be sort of zooming in and have this square part right here. Or we can zoom out and have black, basically this would be black at the top and bottom of the screen. A lot of people didn't like that. They wanted the whole TV screen to be a picture. They didn't want this black stuff at the top and the bottom. Letterbox, my parents were like that. But then you're lopping off the sides of the picture. So there is a wonderful documentary on that on the Turner Classic Movie channel. And the DVD that I recorded that off of, that I show in class, comes after a widescreen movie called Forbidden Planet, which came out in 1956. It's a very cool widescreen movie. Here's a bit of it right here. Very nice effects. A lot of sci-fi movies. This is kind of a side point, but let's have a little fun here. But pretty nice. These would be paintings and things, but they had very nice, cool flying saucers. And that film was a big influence on Gene Roddenberry, because they are in a starship. And it was also a big influence on George Lucas, because there is a giant set, and I have linked to that scene. It's a wonderful scene. There is this alien race that is no longer around called the Krell, and they have this big giant machine, and every time I see where this giant machine is, as the people walk through, I imagine some Jedi Knights having a lightsaber battle. And when you see it, you'll probably think the same thing if you've seen any of the Star Wars movies. It looks just like that. And George Lucas even said that he was highly influenced from Forbidden Planet and The Wonderful Set. It also has some pretty cool electronic music. So it's kind of a cool movie. This is a little bit of a side trip from our fall of the studio system. But I know there are lots of my students that are sci-fi fans and so on. And so I thought we'd take this little side trip and talk about Forbidden Planet. And I've linked to the Krill machine. Okay, so for part of the fall, and just a little bit here more on aspect ratio. This is television aspect ratio before flat screen came in, before HD came in, and that is the size of old movies like Casablanca and The Wizard of Oz. And so they started making wider movies. This is the standard size for 35 millimeter film, and then they started making widescreen movies like this. So how are you going to rectify this with this? So this 2:3:9:1 is basically that size. So 2.3 times as wide as it is high. Okay, so it's all just by units. A square would be 1 unit by 1 unit. Okay, and so this is basically 1 unit by 2.4 units. So that's a widescreen movie. And then most movies are like this, 1.8 times as wide. So 1.8 times as wide. Okay, anyway, maybe that's a little bit too much for you there. Don't worry about all these numbers or anything, but if you love movies and all that, then it's a little something for you. A little treat on how this whole aspect ratio thing works. Because even on our HD flat screens, we still have a little bit of letterboxing. Not nearly as much as TV used to have, but we still have a little bit of letterboxing. So the upshot of some of this is that the unintended consequence is that drive-ins start to rise. The studios had to sell off their theaters, and they aren't controlling the whole theater part of it so much anymore. And so there are a lot of baby boomers, okay, all the little babies that might have been born during the Depression and might have been born during World War II. People held off on that. And then after the war and all the people came back from Europe and came back from the Pacific, babies are being born, right? That pent-up demand, you might say. And so there are lots of babies born between 1945 and 1960. Many of your college professors, including myself, born during those years. And so these new families with their little rugrats running around, wanting their kids to have nice backyards and all that. So there's a big move to the suburbs, right, away from apartments and so on in the center of cities, and move to the suburbs. And now families and taking little kids, little squirmy little kids, crying little kids into theaters. It's a rather aggravating experience, I'm sure, for a lot of parents. So the drive-in kind of solves that problem. You can take your little kids, and they can talk, or they can cry all they want, and you're not really bothering anybody. The other thing that they used to do is they would put playgrounds right down here, right down front, and you can actually keep an eye on your kids on the teeter-totter or whatever, and watch the movie. And then the kids could get tired, and they could jump into the car and go to sleep, and you could watch the rest of the movie. So drive-ins were a pretty big thing. We are lucky to still have them here in Southern California. And I have given you a list of the drive-ins that are around, and they are open during the virus virus crisis. So if you want to go to the drive-in and pretend you're in Rebel Without a Cause or Grease or Hairspray, then you can do that. In 1960, 30%, almost a third of all screens in the United States were outdoors. There are some in the summer that are inflatable screens at the beach. I've seen those. Sometimes they're even at like the fairgrounds or something like that. You can bring like a beach chair and watch a movie outdoors. But for the true drive-in experience, you are in a car. And today, a lot of people have pickup trucks and um, SUVs and things like that, and so they will back in to the parking lot, and you can lie in the back of the pickup truck, put some bedding and stuff like that down there, and you can lie in the back there. The sound comes through your FM radio, so you tune that into your FM radio. You can bring any food in you want. It's not a big deal. Go buy a pizza or a sandwich or whatever, and then the snack bars at drive-ins. Usually there's one snack bar and 3 screens, and so all the people at the drive-in use the same snack bar, and they have like burritos and hamburgers and stuff like that. A little bit more, but you're allowed to bring your own stuff in. You don't have to hide it or anything like that. You can bring it right on in. So I highly recommend the drive-in experience. It is a ton of fun, and it is. If it's summertime, it's time for the drive-in. This is my drive-in where I grew up in a small town in Michigan, the Caro Drive-In, not very far from where my house was. I could walk there less than a mile. So I went there with my family, and then when I got into high school, I could drive and take a date or party down with my friends. So it was a real fun time. It really is, and you can experience it too, right? We still have it. You can experience it too. Here's the poster. I told you they were B movies, right? Didn't I tell you they were B movies? Well, these are B movies. Let No Man Write Our Epitaph, and Write My Epitaph, Guns of the Black Witch, and so on. So yeah, these are definitely the kinds of B movies that got them that name. Okay, but speaking of terror and so on, we're going to move on. And we have Alfred Hitchcock. He is the master of suspense, and we are going to talk about the auteur theory, and that is where the director is kind of a brand into him or herself. So Hitchcock is the master of suspense. Today we have Quentin Tarantino. He is a brand, right? He makes movies that if you like one, you'd probably like all of them or most of them. Wes Anderson, people like that. The Coen brothers, Steven Spielberg. Certainly, there are a lot of directors that are known. People like me will go see a movie by a director. I don't even care what it's about. If it's a Coen Brothers movie, I'm going to go see it. Or Wes Anderson or whatnot. So anyway, Alfred Hitchcock, and I thought we'd have a little bit of fun. And I have linked to the famous shower scene from Alfred Hitchcock, from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Now, Hitchcock, he was pretty good at this whole branding thing and marketing his name. And so he had a television show called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and he and Walt Disney were really among the very few in Hollywood who embraced early 1950s TV. I told you the studios really ignored it, and then they sort of fought it. But Hitchcock and Walt Disney, they got right into it real early. Remember, TV really, for a lot of people, only began about 1950. So this is just a few years in. And I have linked to Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He hosted the show, and he directed a few episodes. So I have linked to his introduction. He's British. He spoke in a very droll sort of a manner, lots of bad puns, like the suspense was killing them, right? Things like that. Very funny. And people loved Hitch. They loved him, and he became a brand, and he could promote his upcoming movies on his television show. Sort of a thriller, not really horror, but thriller type show. And later on, when we get into television, we will talk about Walt Disney's 2 television programs. One of them was called Disneyland, believe it or not, sort of an ad for his theme park, and the other is the Mickey Mouse Club. So we'll talk about Walt coming up. So, there we go. Okay, Disneyland, 1954, Mickey Mouse Club, 1955. And after you watch the hosting, the introduction of Hitchcock for his program, you can watch the shower scene, or as much of Psycho as you want. It's a good movie. You can watch for extra credit, by the way. So you think about that. There we go. Based on a real life event. He wouldn't show the script to the studio. And they had a challenge to marketing because the star takes a fateful shower 43 minutes into the film. So the star of the movie, Janet Leigh, is killed not even halfway into the movie. And so that was a problem for Hitchcock. And there he is. He actually does this in the trailer for the movie. He hosts the trailer for the movie too, which is pretty funny. So what are they going to do? The star dies. Imagine Jennifer Lawrence or Matt Damon or somebody dying, 43 minutes into the beginning of the movie. Okay, so this is what they did. No entering the theater after the film started. So he didn't want anybody coming into the theater late and maybe even missing, right, if you're 10 or 15 minutes late. And apparently that was a thing back in the 50s and 60s. They really only waited about 15 minutes before starting the movie over again. And so people could arrive at the movie 15, 20, 25 minutes late, watch the movie and wait 15 minutes, go to the restroom or something, and then watch the beginning of the movie. Hitchcock did not want that. So he was very secretive about the script. He wouldn't show the script to the studio or anything like that. And he wanted it to be a shock, right? He wanted the ending. He wanted the shower, but he also wanted the ending to be a real shock. So he was very secretive about all that. And here we see the manager of this theater has been instructed at the risk of his life not to admit to the theater any persons after the picture starts. Any spurious attempts to enter by side doors, fire escapes, or ventilating shafts will be met by force. The entire object of this extraordinary policy, of course, is to help you enjoy Psycho more, signed Alfred Hitchcock. And right here they put the time for the next start. And they would get like fake armed guard actors, basically, in uniform, keeping people out. Nope, sorry, the movie started, sorry, get in line, sorry, sir, sorry, ma'am. So people got to the movie theater real early. They were seen in line outside the theater, drawing attention. Oh, wonder what that movie is. So anyway, really great movie, and you can watch it for extra credit. Don't worry about all this trivia, but there is a famous shower scene, and it's not just violence, but there's also a fair amount of sex. They are not married. That would make it premarital. They're in a hotel room. She's in her lingerie, right, her undergarments. And for 1960, this is kind of pushing the envelope. A lot of people were uneasy seeing Janet Leigh, and we see her like 3 times in her bra and slip. So he didn't really need to do that, but he knew that was going to draw some audience. Okay, so about this time, we have studios reacting to television. We've got these big widescreen movies. More and more movies are in color. They're getting longer and longer. And we get these big bloated movies. And our poster child for the bloated era is Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton. She had a $1 million contract, right? That was a lot of money back in 1961, 62. And they were both married to other people when they made the movie, but they were having a very public affair in the evenings and weekends in Rome, where they were making the movie, and that drew a lot of attention. And morals were a little bit different. Premarital and sneaking around on your spouse and all that was not very well tolerated in 1960. So they were a very famous couple. I know we have very famous couples today in the music industry and in the movie industry and all that, but they were one of the very first. But famous couples goes back to the silent era in the 1920s. There was Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickfair. So the whole famous couple thing goes back a ways. Anyway, $300 million, that's a pretty expensive movie, even by today's standards, when we adjust for inflation. Remember, we have to adjust for inflation. And it lost a lot of money, and that's where Century City came from. 20th Century Fox had to sell off some of their land because of this giant movie. It was a road show picture, which meant that it was a special engagement. It had reserved seating and intermissions, and intermission, sorry. And I have linked to that trailer, and it'll ask you that, reserve your seats now. So it's kind of fun to see the trailer for Cleopatra, and it was a roadshow. And this is partly how studios were addressing the television issue. Okay, make movies big, make them special, reserve seating, more like a theater experience. But the theater has always been kind of expensive, right? If you go to the theater or concerts, it's always kind of expensive. Movies have always been fairly inexpensive entertainment, from a nickel, quarter, whatever. Even today, $10, $11, $12, $13 is not very much when you consider how much concerts cost and the theater and sporting events. Okay, so it's still a pretty good deal, and now they're making it kind of a big thing. The tickets cost a little bit more, and they're doing all this, and it wasn't really a good business decision for them. It didn't quite work. Movies are fun, but they're not supposed to be special like going to a concert, I guess. So they had limited release also, so they would play first in big cities and then mid-sized towns, and then finally in small towns. So it's sort of a slow rollout. We still have that today, but mostly with small movies that are trying to get critical attention and Oscar attention. So that's what they did for the movies. Okay, they were, or that's what they're doing today for the movies. Sorry, a little bit of music coming through. Okay. So we still have limited release movies today. But like I say, mostly for those small Oscar-type movies like Parasite and things like that, a slow rollout. All right, let's move on to foreign reaction to these bloated films. And we have the French New Wave and Breathless. And I've linked, strangely enough, to the entire film. You don't have to watch the entire film. I would watch the scene with them sort of walking around. It's kind of interesting because it's a handheld camera early in the film, and they go driving around in the car, and you'll see some jump cuts and things like that. And they are walking down the big shopping streets, and people sort of look at them, and the person that is operating the camera has hidden the camera. It is I think it was in a bag or something like that, like a mail bag, a canvas bag, and you can see them walking around holding the camera just like this, about waist high, filming this scene clandestinely on the streets of Paris. And it broke a lot of the rules for Hollywood, so it's kind of a fun movie. It really is. It's kind of a fun movie to see them, almost like a student movie, really. They're shooting on the streets, trying to avoid the police. And people are walking through, right? They're walking around, walking through. They don't really know that it's a movie, but you see people sort of looking around, and there's some guy backing up in front of them, the camera operator, and maybe the director. So, but people in big cities, they just go about their daily business. So they broke a lot of those rules of classic Hollywood, and like I say, it is kind of fun to see. So watch a little bit of them walking around and so on. And when they get in the car and go driving around, you'll see some jump cuts. Jump cut is where you just take some time out of the middle of a scene. So there might be a scene that goes on for 30 or 40 seconds, and basically they're just lopping off 10 or 15 seconds out of the middle of that scene, and it jumps, right? They're not using the traditional hide the edit by cutting to reaction shots and things like that, and wide shots and whatnot. They don't like what's going on. They just chop it out, right? And you get a jump in the film. So breaking a lot of the rules, and a lot of um, young filmmakers who would be up-and-coming filmmakers that are film students going to film schools, USC, UCLA, New York University, things like that. Steven Spielberg, Francis Coppola, Martin Scorsese are going to be seeing these kinds of movies, thinking this is great. These are small, personal films, and they're going to want to make movies like that. But instead, they're going to get sucked into the Hollywood machine and make movies like Star Wars and The Godfather. They're going to make big budget movies, but they started off wanting to make these kinds of movies, these small little personal cutting edge type movies, and they would have seen these in film school. Okay, staying overseas for a little bit, we're going to have the rise of international filmmaking, and we have the James Bond franchise as our example. A franchise movie, right? You can just make sequel after sequel after sequel. That is the big thing in the business today. The Marvel franchise and the Harry Potter franchise and the Fast and Furious franchise. There are lots and lots of and still the James Bond franchise since 1962. So this is really the big business model in Hollywood these days is to try to get a franchise going, even a new franchise going. And so I have linked to some of Goldfinger, and it's a lot of fun. I have to say, filmmakers have gotten quite good at editing and stunts and staging fights and all that, much better than in the past. In the past, they had great acting, great stories, great scripts, all of that. It's wonderful, but action isn't quite what we're used to today. So you can watch a little bit of the opening for Goldfinger, and they're kind of fun. Again, don't worry about all this whole list. It's not on the test, but this was the formula, right? And if you made the James Bond movie with the right formula, with the opening action sequence, basically opening the movie with the last mission, okay, that's the way they did it. You get the big title sequence with the big song, with the famous people, and whoever sings the song for the James Bond film, that will be in your newsfeed. They just mentioned, I think Billie Eilish is doing it. I'm not sure, but somebody is doing the song, and it was in all the news feeds, just like I predicted, right, from Paul McCartney and whatever on through. So it's a big an honor, I guess. Then we have Q and his high-tech gadgets, Q for Quartermaster, and that's where James Bond gets his cool toys, his Aston Martin, and all that cool stuff, and the double entendre women's names. We get the villain's lair and the henchmen, right? So all that stuff is going to be part of the James Bond formula, and if you do it right, then you're going to have a hit. And if you spend enough money. Again, don't worry, but these are all the Bonds, okay? So there's the first one, Sean Connery. And he is my favorite because that's the first one, right? That's always your first love. And so for you, at some point, there will be another Thor, there will be another Iron Man, there will be another Harry Potter, right? This is good intellectual property, and it's kind of weird, right? I saw 6 Sean Connery James Bond movies, and then all of a sudden there was a new James Bond, and it was a very weird feeling. And for sure, there will be another Captain America. It won't be Chris Evans, and it'll be real weird. And you'll see it, or Iron Man, or Thor, or whoever, Harry Potter, whatever. Right, they'll introduce it to a whole new audience, and you will long back to the first time that you saw an Avenger or a Batman or something. Although they've rebooted Batman and Superman a couple of times, and Spider-Man a couple of times. So I guess we've kind of seen a little bit of that already, the whole recasting, rebooting, and so on. Apparently Daniel Craig's on his last James Bond, so after the movie comes out in November, we get to see another James Bond. Okay, And now we are getting into the 1960s, and it was a pretty lively time in the world, and especially in America. And so there are social influences that are going to affect American filmmakers, and frankly, television and music as well. So when we talk about music, and we talk about maybe Bob Dylan and protest songs and things like that, all this stuff was going on, right? The war in Vietnam and so on was a big deal. There's the war and the draft. There's my draft card, by the way, that's mine. And it affected young people. All this stuff had a big effect on young people because you would register for the draft on your 18th birthday or thereabouts, and you could get drafted. So the draft was a form of a lottery. All the days of the year would be put on ping pong balls in a spinning drum, and then number 1 through number 365 got put into another big rolling drum, and somebody could pull out a day of the year, like August 28, and then they could pick out a number, like 37, and so everybody born 18 years prior on August 28th would have a draft number of 37, and the significance of that is that the Army needed about the first 100 or so, and then they had enough. So if you had a draft number of under 100, then you were likely to maybe get called up, drafted, unwillingly in many instances. And if you had a draft number of 200 or something like that, then you were kind of done. You didn't have to worry about it. So there was lots of that on campus, right? The idea was that there are certain deferments, physical, right? I suppose if you had a very poor eyesight or diabetes, things like that, you would get a draft deferment, 4F, I think that was. If you were homosexual, okay, if you were gay, and back then, young men didn't want to fake it or pretend. There was a stigma. It was a stigma. You'd have a little bit of a hard time finding work, and so on. So unless men were actually gay, nobody was going to fake being gay to stay out of the war in Vietnam. You could go to Canada, right? That was also popular. Or you could be a student. So a student would have 2S as their thing, as their designation, and that would get them, you had to be a full-time student, right? You had to be a full-time student, carry a full-time load, and it was good for those 4 years. And then after you graduated, you couldn't go to grad school, and you couldn't take part-time classes. But if you were a student back then you had 4 years of a draft deferment. So that's how I didn't go to Vietnam. We have rock and roll music and youth culture, right? So Woodstock and all of that. This is new music before music was sort of for everybody. Frank Sinatra or people like that, Frankie Lane, whatever, Doris Day. And now there's music that young people like, that older people, their parents don't like. So that is a social influence for sure. Recreational drug use, starting with marijuana, coming out of the South and Southeast and the ghettos and jazz musicians and all that sort of thing, and coming through college campuses and working their way out into society. LSD, psychedelics, peyote, all that kind of stuff is also a influence on American films. Okay, we're going to get movies like Easy Rider, things like that. We're going to get long hair on the men and miniskirts on the ladies. There's me and my buddies. Okay, so we worked at record stores. We weren't musicians, although a lot of these guys were musicians and so on. But we had the cool job back then, working in a record store with our long hair and all of that. But that was kind of not quite the stigma that being gay was, but for a lot of people, long hair really meant that you were anti-war and pro-pod and all the whole rest of it. It sort of had a extra dimension to it. And we have a lot of that today, even with face masks and things like that. There's lots of signifiers, as they call them. And so if you had long hair, it probably meant that you were, stoner and out of the, a middle finger to society and all that kind of thing. So that was a social influence, to be sure. Civil rights and voting rights. There's Martin Luther King Jr. and people, right? Ralph Abernathy and some other people. I bet that's Coretta Scott. I don't know everybody, but they are marching. This might not be the March on Selma, but they are really trying to get blacks to be able to register to vote. And in the South, there were very, very few blacks allowed to register to vote, believe it or not. We think of that as a kind of a common right, but they would be asked to spend a certain amount of money to register, asked to recite the Declaration of Independence or some crazy thing, and a lot of people couldn't do that. So just the idea of registering to vote, and young college kids from the North rode buses down south to register blacks to vote. They were called Freedom Riders. Some of them were killed for their efforts. Yeah, some of them were killed for their efforts of just registering to vote. It really seems like something out of a science fiction or something. But that had been going on since the late 50s, and it is still going on into the 60s. Civil rights. Women's equality is also in the news, and roiling society, equal pay for equal work, things like that. Why most people paid women less than men, because they weren't the breadwinners of the family, things like that. There were very few female doctors, very few female lawyers, very few female business owners. Women were expected to have women's jobs like secretaries or store clerks or nurses, but certainly not those men-type jobs. Yes, this is the 1960s. Seems like a million years ago. Now today, women are more than half of all college students. That's a big thing. Big change. Good change. Very good change. And we also have Watergate. And the Watergate was a business. It's a big building that had apartments in it and businesses in it, and one of those offices was the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and some people working on the Nixon re-election campaign in the dead of night snuck in. They planted bugs in there. The election was coming up, and they were spying on the Democratic candidate, George McGovern, and they got caught. And it took about a year, but through investigation and so on, it turned out that the money paying them off and keeping them quiet came from the White House and the Attorney General, the head law enforcement officer in the country. So Nixon resigned his office before he could have the impeachment trial. And they told him he would probably lose. The Republican senators told him he would probably lose the trial, so he resigned. And that was a big thing in the early 70s. Very big thing. Also, around this period, we have the ratings system coming in and replacing the production code. This is, maybe you can figure out what this movie is. Okay, this was kind of part of that. I will tell you in a minute. Self-censorship again. Now it's age-based, right? So all movies aren't for the entire family. Now it's age-based. And this movie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, he's got a beating heart in his hand. Pa-pump, pa-pump, pa-pump. And it was rated PG. It was rated PG. And a lot of parents were upset. Their little, tender 6- and 7-year-old kids would go to the movie and see this fire pit and this live heart pumping and be scared and crying and all that sort of thing. And so PG-13 was added. There is a difference between a 6-year-old and a 13-year-old or 14-year-old, for sure. And so um, that this movie wasn't rated PG-13, but going forward, that one, and Gremlins too. These little gremlins, right? They're animatronic dolls, but little kids don't know that, right? Little kids don't know, and they're getting put into microwaves and stuff, and down garbage disposals, and they're freaking out. So those two movies really pushed PG-13, and then in 1990, NC-17 replaces X. A lot of theaters refused to show X-rated movies. Newspapers refused to allow ads for X-rated movies. Video stores wouldn't stock X-rated videos. And the main reason for that is because it wasn't trademarked. So the adult film industry started putting out triple X-rated movies. Triple X-rated movies. Here's Deep Throat, a very famous film. And so it got co-opted, right? People saw X and they thought immediately that it was an adult movie, and they really weren't. An X-rated movie actually has won the Best Picture Oscar, Midnight Cowboy, and it just has some drugs and homosexuality and things like that, and some language, but it was rated X, and it won the Best Picture Oscar in 1969. So there you go. We start getting movies that are reflecting all these long-haired college students and whatever, and hippies and all the whole rest of it. The new Hollywood takes hold. Easy Rider there, starring Dennis Hopper as the director, directed by Dennis Hopper, starring Peter Fonda. And Jack Nicholson, look, he gets third billing, and that really made him a star. He's only on screen for maybe 20 minutes or so, but it really made him a star. And we have this spiritual quest, the freedom of the open road, and a great soundtrack, a very rock soundtrack, not the Beatles, and not like Simon and Garfunkel with The Graduate, but this is Jimi Hendrix and Steppenwolf and Born to Be Wild and all of that. So I've linked to the opening with Born to Be Wild and so on. So you can check out a little bit of Easy Rider, and there's a wonderful scene of everybody sitting around the fire at night, passing around a marijuana, cigarette, a joint, a doobie, whatever, and it's fun. You'll like it. And at this time, we start to have the film school generation starts getting out and making movies, led by Francis Coppola, followed closely by Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma and people like that, right? So they start getting that designation, these film school kids. Now there are lots of other filmmakers making lots of really good movies, but they got that designation, film school generation, and because they made these big giant hits, you know, Jaws and Godfather and all of that, Taxi Driver and everything. So we have the film school generation. A wonderful movie, The Godfather, and I have linked to a scene for sure. A couple of scenes from The Godfather. So enjoy those. The opening of the movie and toward the ending. And lastly, this is a second golden age for movies, represented by The Godfather and Chinatown and movies like that. First golden age was back in the 30s, right? Remember, 39 is the key year, 37, 44. And here we have the late 60s, starting with Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and 2001, and going into the 1970s with The Godfather and Chinatown and Taxi Driver and all of that. It's a second golden age. So a lot going on, all those social influences, not much of a change in technology, but we do get the widescreen movies. I guess that's a change in technology. We get the widescreen. In our third part of the history of motion pictures and the business and all that, we will talk about technology in a much bigger way and talk about the new CGI technology, and I will give you a nice history overview of CGI in our third and final class on motion pictures. So until then, unless you're binging, it'll be next week, but if you're binging, you can go right to it. And Professor Dave Eccles signing off, and until next time, take care.